Hello, and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. In recent years, I've noticed the interesting trend of people citing Shadowlands as the worst WoW expansion. I can certainly understand how people would feel this way. It's certainly almost nobody's favorite, it shorted us a raid tier, and the story was far from WoW at its best. But I feel people forget far too quickly just how terrible the story in BFA was. And this video is going to focus entirely on the story. Personally, I was completely fine with the gameplay of both expansions, but that's neither here nor there. In the first of what I'm sure will be many videos lambasting BFA's shortcomings, I will now make the case for why Battle for Azeroth, and not Shadowlands, was WoW's storytelling low point. Before I go further though, I do want to put a bit of a disclaimer here. I love WoW's storytelling in general. It isn't the most intricate or nuanced, but it doesn't need to be. It just needs to be fun and coherent. Honestly, the leveling quests for both expansions were on point. Great times were had in Zandalar, Kul Tiras, and all of the initial zones of Shadowlands. With one obvious exception, I don't bear any ill will towards any of the story team, even if I don't agree with all of their writing decisions. I also don't necessarily think I could have written the story better than them. Generally speaking, it is just far easier to critique an already existing story than to create that story in the first place. This is due both to the benefit of hindsight and being able to add your own separate brain and worldview to the story and analysis of it. And of course, it's not as simple as just writing a good story. This is a game. Gameplay decisions inform the story decisions a lot of the time, and due to the production pipeline, it can become extremely difficult to pivot. That being said, it's extremely cathartic to rant, so here we go. Historically, I've liked to describe BFA as having malicious writing, whereas Shadowlands has incompetent writing. And expanding on that, Dragonflight would probably have safe or dull writing. Now, when I say BFA has malicious writing, this can be taken literally if we are to believe the claims that Afrasiabi basically sabotaged Sylvanas' arc out of spite for how Garrosh wound up. Given what we know about the guy and how he treats women in general, it's very easy to buy into this, and as much as I want to myself to easily explain what happened, we don't actually have any primary sources on that. It's entirely possible that he just really did flub the writing, and by and large, neither writers nor devs have an incentive to be malicious towards their audience. But regardless of intent, what we actually got out of Battle for Azeroth's story felt very spiteful to a large portion of the player base. Whereas for Shadowlands, I never got that vibe. The writing in that expansion felt very much like the writers were attempting to tell a story with a scope beyond their own capabilities. This sort of leads me to the main weak points of each expansion's writing. Shadowlands had a big problem with spectacle creep. This is a concept in writing that is very similar to power creep. Basically, it's the idea that each thing we get needs to be bigger and more exciting than the last thing. This is a very understandable concept and in general is something that writers should adhere to, but you need to keep it in check. So if we take a look at the leveling zones and quests from Shadowlands, it's actually pretty great. I know not everyone loves that it demystified the afterlife, but the world building was pretty great in these zones. I would especially point to Ardenweald and Revendreth as having great cultures and stories attached to them. And if events had stayed at that level, cosmically speaking, I think it could have been okay. Like, we didn't have to go to Zereth Mortis. The Shadowlands were supposed to be infinite. How come we only ever really explored 5 of the Covenant zones? Craftenium was a realm that was name-dropped for inventive types, and we never really saw a realm that really seemed to fit with the Orc and Tauren concept of ancestral reverence. But yeah, as I was saying, the problems become apparent when you examine the Jailer and Zereth Mortis. Not only did the writers attempt to establish Zoval as a Titan plus threat, despite never having heard of him before, but they also attempted to retroactively give him credit for a ton of Warcraft's lore, going so far as to claim that Shadowlands was wrapping up a story that began in Warcraft 3. Nobody liked that. It's artificially aggrandizing a story that you don't believe can stand on its own merit. And then we get even more spectacle creep when we go to Zereth Mortis and find out that all of the afterlives of the Shadowlands are manufactured by a higher power. I can get behind the Eternal Ones being Death's equivalent to the Titan Pantheon for Order, but now you're telling us that there are these first ones that are higher than both of those factions, and you make Zoval's final words be a hint at either those first ones or some other cosmic threat that's even more dangerous than he is? Stop that, Blizzard. Just stop that. And of course the main campaign focusing on Sylvanas, Anduin, and Tyrande wasn't the best, and I don't mean to handwave how Shadowlands handled it, but a lot of it was dealing with the aftermath of BFA and all the problems that it set up in the first place. And yeah, if Spectacle Creep was Shadowlands' main issue, BFA's had to be character assassination. She wasn't the only character to suffer from it, but Sylvanas is the clear and obvious example. The expansion literally starts out with the burning of Teldrassil being entirely attributed to Sylvanas losing her cool over Dalaran talking to her about the concept of hope. Now, even if you hold the view that Sylvanas has been evil ever since she was raised as a banshee, this is clearly a step too far and a very stupid move on her part. Let's not kid ourselves. This was done entirely for shock value and to villain bat Sylvanas. Even Metzen didn't know that she was going to be responsible for it when he wrote the BFA cinematic. And if you want to write a compelling faction war story, you don't do it by immediately painting one side as evil and the other side as righteous. But Sylvanas wasn't just a victim of Afrasiabi's writing. She was a victim of her own popularity. You may scoff at it nowadays, but back before BFA, Sylvanas was almost undisputably the most popular Warcraft character. Yes, even more so than everybody's beloved Arthas, which means that a ton of people wanted to write for her. And considering how aloof of a character Sylvanas had always been, this leaves a ton of room for every writer to have their own beliefs on what her beliefs and thoughts are. This resulted, intentionally or otherwise, in a tug-of-war over her character. You could go from one scene to another with very inconsistent characterization. Is she smart or reckless? Does she care about her allies or not? Does she care about free will or not? It was a mess. And we have situations like Ian claiming that she's not going to be another Garrosh. Now, Ian is definitely not a lore guy, but that just reeks of the plans for her character being steered off course. And then we have Afrasiabi retconning it so that she was complicit in the Wrathgate. And then after that, other writers asserting that no, she wasn't. But Sylvanas is too big of a topic for this video. Let's shift our focus to the war campaign, specifically the Horde side. While I do applaud Blizzard for even adding the option to be a loyalist or a rebel, it's clear they never had any intention of really fleshing it out. They basically treated the rebel path as the correct path, with Sylvanas or Nathanos basically telling the loyalist, yeah, just play along. You're more valuable if your loyalty isn't discovered, even if it means you're thwarting all of our plans along the way. But even if you did as Blizzard wanted you to and played as a rebel, the campaign still made no sense. And this is exemplified no place better than in the Rescue Bane scenario. Here, we basically work with Jaina to rescue Bane from the underhold of Orgrimmar. Now imagine, if you will, that you're doing this as a Blood Elf player. Jaina was responsible for the Purge of Dalaran, where the Sunreaver Blood Elves were ejected from the city and in many cases killed. Magister Hatharel, a Sunreaver, even shows up and calls her out on this, but nothing ever really comes of it. Now imagine doing this scenario as a Zandalari player. Jaina just led the attack on your capital city of Dazar'alor. She stormed your castle and killed King Rastakhan, a monarch beloved by his people for over 200 years. Then, at your king's funeral, while Sylvanas promises Talanji justice for her father's death, Bane decides that this is a good time to assert that maybe we should seek peace with the Alliance. And now, you're expected to work with the person who murdered your king to rescue the person who basically said, get over it. It is completely inane. I am admittedly very biased against Bane, but I think my point still stands. And of course, if you were a loyalist, the game was not shy about shaming you for it. Though you as a player are never punished, you do see loyalist NPCs being drug around Orgrimmar in chains. You see a bunch of characters that you used to love now saying Sylvanas sucks, and so does anyone who stood with her. How dare you choose the faction conflict option in what was billed to us as the faction conflict expansion? Except it wasn't really the faction conflict expansion, was it? Because by 8.2 we were already shifting gears and dealing with Ajara for some reason. And by 8.3 we were dealing with N'Zoth. Each of these characters could have easily carried their own expansion, or at the very least one expansion between the two of them. The fact that the Fourth War was almost entirely abandoned as a plot after 8.1 demonstrated how little faith Blizzard had in their own writing. There are few things more jarring in media than when a storyline is just dropped, especially when it's the main storyline. And if you need more evidence for just how damaging the story of this expansion was, just look at how the player base reacted to it. Huge swaths of the player base started calling for peace and complaining how sick they are of the faction conflict. How factions shouldn't even be a thing when we constantly have to work together to overcome larger threats. And look, I get where these people are coming from. When BFA was announced, the idea of a faction conflict expansion did not excite me, even if the cinematic itself was pretty sick. But the truth is that there are some great stories to be told there. And before this point, we had never had a full-blown war expansion. It had mostly just been Cold War stuff, with little skirmishes here and there. Things escalated a little bit in Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria, but it was never really the focus, and by the time it was the focus, we were already united against Garrosh. So BFA would have been our first time really exploring that. But because of whatever forces were at play, we got a shadow of what that story could have been. Maybe it's not faction conflict that the player base got sick of. It was badly written faction conflict. And most players don't know or just don't believe that it could have been done better. BFA also kind of just ruined the Horde, in my opinion. Like, the faction as it exists today just kind of sucks. But that is another video topic that I am definitely going to make someday, so I won't really be delving into it today. So for all the things you can fault Shadowlands' story for, I don't think they can hold a candle to what BFA did. But even though it kind of grinds my gears when people say otherwise, it's ultimately just my opinion. Now then, there were a ton of characters I could have chosen to draw for this episode. It was a very broad topic, but a lot of the characters I plan to use for other videos, so I decided to go with Jaina. My opinions on her are very complicated. Similar to Sylvanas, she's suffered from being too popular of a character, and thus horribly overused, and drugged back and forth about how she feels about the Horde. She goes from wanting peace, even if it means standing against her father, to after Theramore trying to flood Orgrimmar, to talking in Mists about how important peace is, even if it's difficult, to the Purge of Dalaran, wanting to dismantle the Horde, leaving the Kirin Tor because they want to work with the Horde to repel the Legion, and fighting pretty strongly against the Horde in BFA until suddenly, oh, it's time for peace again. So like Sylvanas, at this point it's kind of hard to view her as an actual character. But I still have nostalgia for Warcraft 3 when she was a lot simpler. And I think how they handled her in the Kultiris questing was pretty sound. One could say, Tiergard sound. I think her redesign looks sick. I think Daughter of the Sea is one of the best pieces of media Blizzard has produced. I think making her the racial leader for Kultirans was a neat way of sort of retroactively justifying her prominence in the story. And I think the 8.0 quests about her learning to forgive herself were relatable and beautifully done. Whether or not she actually deserves that forgiveness is a bit debatable, but it's Warcraft. If you actually dissect any character, they're all pretty much terrible people. So that bit of suspension of disbelief I'm okay with. I will say I'm also not really a fan of just how OP they've made her. Like, she should not be able to single-handedly lift a battleship into the air and use it as an airship. And I could have done without the Lystra, who is thousands of years old, fangirling over her and how amazing her human potential magic is. It's also kind of crazy how she's had romantic relationships with both the future Lich King and the aspect of magic, who I'll remind you is a big blue dragon. Like, girl, you need to work on yourself. Maybe just stay single for a little while longer. But I digress. Overall, she's an okay character. I don't love her, I don't hate her. Anyway, I set her in Borealis because that should be her seat of power, and I gave her the Glacial Tidestorm mount as a water elemental summon, because that mount is slick as ice. Oh ho ho, yes indeed. I think she wound up looking a little more stout than I would have preferred, but overall I'm pretty content with the results. But that's enough blabbering from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye bye!